Either one.
You want to sit in the middle?
No, I'm going to sit off to the side. Just because
Okay.
I can look at you both by turning left.
That sounds good.
And you should sit together. Everybody's going to run out and buy the book, and they'll soon go deep. But let's talk about this. What kind of work were you doing, and why did they come after you?
The first part's a little bit easier than the second.
Yeah.
But, I moved to Iran in the spring of 2009. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area originally. My dad was from Iran. My mom was from Wheaton, Illinois. I'm sure some of you are familiar. That's Billy Graham country. And so, these two people who decided to take very different paths away from their conservative upbringings, one in the Midwest of the United States, one in the Middle East, met at the library at San Francisco State University in the 60s. That's the official story. I don't know. But I was always fascinated with my dad's homeland throughout my childhood, growing up in the 80s. Little by little, many of his siblings, he had 8 brothers and sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, immigrated to the US following the revolution in Iran in 1979. And my experience with Iranian culture was very different than what we saw on the news. And as a college student, I began traveling quite a bit around the world. In the late 90s, when I was in my early 20s, the US dollar was historically strong. Travel was easy for the first time for a lot of young people, and I went around the world. But the holy grail for me was always Iran. And I knew that I wanted to be a journalist. I thought in my mind, if I would be able to travel to Iran at some point, I could work from that place. Very few Western journalists were based there. And flash forward to 2009, after several trips getting to know the place, I picked up and moved there full-time as a freelancer. During those years, in the first year actually, I met Yeganeh, who was working as a translator. She had been going to school studying English translation, had a master's degree in English translation, and we began dating.
Do you speak Farsi?
After prison, I spoke a lot better Farsi.
They gave him a crash course.
Yeah, the hard way.
Yeah, exactly. I spoke it okay, right?
Also, his in-laws play a very important role in that.
Okay.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time. I learned. You learn quickly, right? But I also brought Yeganeh into journalism, which I'm not sure if that's a happy thing or not at this point. But in 2014, we were 2/5 of the English language newspaper media in Iran. And our home was sort of a hotbed for a lot of activity. This was after the current president, Hassan Rouhani, had been elected in 2013. There was an opening, if you will. Media was allowed back in. There was a lot of excitement about Iran, negotiations between the US and Iran. First time since the revolution were taking place at a very high level over the nuclear file. And I was covering that story very closely, as was Yeganeh. And one night in late July of 2014, we were preparing to go to a surprise birthday party for her mom. We walked out the front door of our high-rise apartment, took the elevator down to the basement where the garage was, and when the elevator doors opened, there were 3 men standing there, one of them with a gun pointed right at me, who said my name. When a gun is pointed at you and somebody says your name, I guess you say, yes, that's me, but, or maybe you don't, but we didn't have anywhere to run. And these 3 people forced their way into the elevator, took us back up to our apartment, which they proceeded to ransack over the next couple of hours. Yeganeh and I were separated in our own home forced to relinquish our passwords to our devices. They confiscated all of our identification documents, our passports. And after a couple of hours, very unceremoniously told us that it was time to go. They paraded us out our building in front of neighbors. I realized later that this is done on purpose as sort of a walk of shame, a cautionary tale to other people. We were put in the back of a van with tinted windows, blindfolded and handcuffed, and taken off to Evin Prison, where we spent the next long stretch of time.
And for context, this is 2014. This is during a time of relative thaw in U.S.-Iranian relations. It's Obama still president. The U.S.-Iran nuclear agreement has not been ratcheted back. That wouldn't happen for another 3 years, really.
The negotiations were really just beginning in earnest and reached a very high level. I had just returned from a session of those talks in Vienna 48 hours before we were arrested. It took months to really understand, but what happened to us was that we were part of a campaign by internal forces in the Iranian regime that did not want to see that deal go forward. We tend to think of dirty politics and party politics as not applicable to Iran. It's a dictatorship, it's a theocracy, it's authoritarian. But guess what? They've got the same internal rivalries as we do anywhere else in the world. The difference is they're very willing and ready to use people as sacrificial pieces of the puzzle.
So Yegi's also detained.
Yes.
But you get out ahead sooner.
Yes. I think it's worth saying that I was not a U.S. citizen at the time, and proudly I am now. It took only 4 years. So I think, first of all, they were not sure if we were married, so they did not do their homeworks best. After they found out that, yes, they were married, it was their tactic to keep me there for 2.5 months, or as we talk about it, 72 nights, the entire time in solitary, because I was the wife of the American spy, the most wanted American spy. In fact, I was in solitary longer than he was. Part of it was because to obviously put pressure on him and scare him and use that as a pressure point to force him to admit to things that he didn't do, confess to things that he didn't do. But also part of it, I figured that out later, like as days went by, that I was like a checking point. They would go and ask him many, many questions and interrogate him for hours, and then they would bring those questions to me and make sure that when they say your house was a CIA station in Tehran, if I also admit to that or not. So after, I think, 2.5 months, they were eventually finished. They could not find, they had all of my stories, articles printed out, highlighted, underlined, everything. But there was really nothing wrong in any of my reporting, even by their standards.
Or mine.
True.
It's worth noting that the day that we were arrested, we were given 1-year extensions of our press credentials in Iran. And those are handed out by the Ministry of Intelligence.
Which works under President Rouhani.
So we had been very much vetted by the system, but detained by a competing intelligence branch of the government.
So you get out, but I mean, you're a Washington Post reporter. It doesn't go unnoticed.
Right, and so when Yegi was released, I mean, for me, that was the biggest weight off my shoulders, as you can imagine. But it was also a warning sign that I might be there for a very long time.
Exactly.
And I had no window into what was being done in the outside world. I was kept in solitary confinement for 7 weeks, and then I was placed in a larger cell with one other person who I ultimately ended up spending 13 months with. No activity, no interaction with the general population of the prison. I had an Iranian state television in my cell. And anybody that knows anything about authoritarian regimes and their state television, I mean, it's propaganda. And oftentimes, they would talk about me and the need to exterminate me. It wasn't until months later that Yegi was able to start visiting me on a more regular basis that I started to understand that every time that they would make a big threat against me, it was in response to something that was going on outside here in the United States in support of me. But it wasn't until after my release that I really started to see, oh my God, I blush when I think about all the people who stood up in support of us and our freedom.
Jason, how do you stay sane in solitary confinement? Many people do not make it nearly as long as you did.
Well, look, I think there's a couple of ways to trick your mind and your body. I spent a lot of time walking in my cell, and I was in a cell, if you can imagine, 4.5 by 8.5 feet. So not very big. So walking from one side to the other doesn't take that long. But I would do that for hours on end and count my how many times I was going back and forth. If I lost count, I'd start again. I'd interview myself sometimes. Several people who didn't who I haven't actually ever met have interviewed me. Which is weird because I see him on TV and I know that guy. No. And you have to plan for the future. You have to plan for a future that you have to believe exists beyond those walls. And I don't think that's an easy thing to do. I mean, in the cells next to me, in the solitary, I was in a cell block with maybe 10 or 12 cells. I couldn't speak to other prisoners, but I could hear them in their cells sometimes. Not everybody takes that approach, right? People scream and wail and, ask to be let go or ask to be put out of their misery. And I just, I could understand that wasn't the way to get through this. Just slow it down and, when Lydia was talking and she said that, she had to promise that she wouldn't talk about being abused and sign things after her release. You do whatever you're told when you're in a situation like that. These people are crazy and they hold the power over your life. But every time I was taken out of the prison, whether it was to, a court session or the 1 or 2 times that we met with lawyers at the prosecutor's office, I made it very clear that I was being abused, I was being tormented psychologically, I was being denied my most basic rights. And then they would come back, and when I was taken back into prison, my interrogators would come and say, "Why would you say all of these things?" I said, "Well, it's the truth. You know it's the truth, and I know it's the truth." So you have to keep competing sets of mental books for yourself and just hope for the best.
We're going to open this out in just a moment, but what are some of the forces that came together to secure your release? Do you know even now?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about some of the ones that you were in contact with?
Sure. Obviously, I would say his mom and his brother played a very, very major role. They were my contacts to the outside world because when I was released under 12 different conditions, including not having any social media presence, not talking to media. They took my press credential away, so I couldn't work as a journalist anymore. I had to move back in with my parents. They made me give up our apartment, and they knew that I knew that they were watching the internet in wherever I was, in the place that I was staying with my parents. So his brother was my voice with the outside world. We now know that Washington Post was effortless. In fact, I think if you were a journalist and if you happen to go to prison, you want employers like Washington Post people.
And I mean, look, when we say that, people all the time say, damn right, that's what they're supposed to do. Yeah, that's what they're supposed to do, but not every organization takes care of people the way that...
No, if you think about it, like many of us in the media, not me personally, but others, work for big media conglomerates, of which journalism is this large, and they may not have quite the same sense of how to protect reporters.
I think in a situation like ours, it really took a large village of people to get us out. It always starts with your family being willing to be public, speak out about what's going on. And I think my brother was very effective at lobbying people in Washington to give a damn. We were beneficiaries of that political moment, that there were negotiations going on between Iran and the U.S., but my freedom was never the priority in those negotiations. Somebody had to force it into being a priority, and I credit my brother with that. I credit Marty Barron and the Washington Post, my editor Doug Gell, who's still the foreign editor there. We've brought up Jeff Bezos' name a couple of times over the last couple of days. I'm a big fan of Jeff Bezos because he went to great lengths to make sure that I was freed. Our member of Congress, we live in Washington, D.C. now, so we're kind of stateless people in a way. But my member from Marin County, where I grew up, Jared Huffman, became a very vocal and committed advocate, continues to help us, in issues. And I can't forget Anthony Bourdain, who, we were lucky enough to be interviewed for his show when he came to Iran.
5 weeks before we were arrested.
And, from the moment that we were arrested, if you go back and look, within a couple of weeks, he had written an op-ed. He spoke about us on TV. He was in constant communication with the State Department about ways to help the situation and not hinder it. And then when we were released, continued to be an incredible friend and advocate to Yegi and I. If you decide to pick up a copy of my book or ever see it, you will see that it's part of the Anthony Bourdain imprint. He was passionate about us telling our story and supporting us.
So when you got out in the honored tradition of Americans detained in Iran, you get the Landstuhl.
Yeah.
Was it Air Force Base in Germany?
Yes.
Yeah. And then, but how do you get to the United States? Just tell us about that.
So this is. I'm going to let Yegi take over here, but go ahead.
I would normally say, please read the book. But in this case, yes, we got on the plane from Tehran to Geneva on a Swiss airplane, from Geneva to Landstuhl on a State Department airplane. We were there for 5 nights. And
getting various medical and psychological care.
Traveling inside Jeff Bezos. Private jet from Landstuhl back to United States. And because I was undocumented, when I say undocumented means I did not have a single piece of paper saying this is who I am, not in English, not in Farsi, not in any other human languages.
They never returned Yegi's IDs after she was released.
So we are arriving with someone who is not only stateless, but no one is sure what they should call me. And this was eventually coordinated after many hours on the air, that we arrive in a bit secluded, more private, less busy airport. And we were just a handful of people, maybe less than a handful of people. Me, Jason, his mom, his brother, Jeff Bezos, his editor, and Washington Post lawyer. That's it. And somehow, I still don't know who or how it was decided that we arrive in Maine. So we have a very special...
So when the plane landed, it was Maine?
Very special connection to Maine. And within a few minutes before we landed, they said we are going to Bangor, Maine. And if you have never traveled to the United States before, you don't know where Bangor is.
Even if you're from the United States, some people from Maine don't even know where it is.
No, it's near Old Town. It's not hard to find. Oh, there you go.
So to me, it sounded like Bangalore, and I was confused whether we are going to India or United States. But finally we arrived, and the only thing I remember, obviously we did not have cameras to film it or anything. I don't think we were in the mood to do that. But I only remember snow everywhere in the airport and beautiful, really tall, green pine trees. And I thought to myself, well, this is exactly what I saw in the movies. And there was a really, really nice DHS officer, super nice.
He was 6'7", 320 pounds.
Ginger hair,
beard down to here. Yeah.
Definitely, you don't want to deal with such an officer if you arrive with 0 documents. But I knew that I was in special hands and taken care of. And he walked into our plane, and he had teary eyes, and he made all of us crying by saying that, welcome to the country, and I am so glad that you are healthy, and they finally let you go. You know what? They know that if they, what did he say? If
you screw with one of us, you screw with all
of us.
That's what he said. Yeah.
So.
And we got off the plane. We went into the arrival hall. There was nobody there. There was several DHS officers and the airport chaplain. And Yegi and the Post lawyer went in for her to be processed. And she came back and she was crying. And I was standing there with my mom and my brother and Doug Gell, my editor, and Jeff Bezos. And I said, what happened? What's wrong? And she said, nothing's wrong. I just feel so moved by the welcome that I've gotten from my new country, and so ashamed of how my home country treated us. And it was just a really poignant moment. There was not a dry eye at that airport. We picked up a bunch of lobsters. Got on the plane, and that was it.
Let me ask you.
That's true. There was lobsters on the plane.
All right, there you go. It has to happen if you come here. Let's talk about politics. Now in 2020, the U.S. has withdrawn from the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal, dragged the Europeans to enforce sanctions, kicking and screaming. The U.S. has decided to apply new pressure on Iran. How does this play out in Iran for people who are trying to push for liberalization of a society that you have found so repressive?
I think that the repressive aspects of Iranian society are the official aspects of it. Like anywhere else in the world, people want a freer, more open way of living. And they've shown that in every way that they can, whether through the limited scope of the ballot box in that country over the years. They just had a parliamentary election yesterday, or through street protests. And increasingly, because the opportunities for public manifestations of their angst have become so limited and restricted online. I mean, there's more and more Iranians on social media than one would expect from a country where social media is officially blocked. So I think it's been a really tough situation for Iranians. They were super hopeful about the nuclear deal in 2016. It never panned out the way that they had hoped. And now there's a real sense of hopelessness in the country. I mean, Yegi was telling me this morning about the number of coronavirus suspected cases, confirmed cases, 5 deaths already.
At least.
We know about the Ukrainian airliner that was shot down there a few weeks ago by the Iranian regime at a really tense moment. I think all of these things are reminders to the people of Iran that they don't have any friends in the world, not in their own government and not in the West. And that's a stark comparison to where we were during the end of the Reagan years and the beginning of the Bush years with the Soviet Union, right? I mean, we were really doing a lot of things to help civil society in the Soviet Union. And there's no sign of that in regards to Iran, and that's a real shame.
And we're not at any level telegraphing that there's even tacit support for civil society in Iran.
We say that we are with the Iranian people and we support their yearning for freedom, but at every angle, every move is designed to make their lives more difficult, with the intent of creating enough economic pressure through sanctions that they, come out in droves into the street to protest the regime. That's happened several times. I can't, there's more historians in the room with a lot of knowledge that I can't contend with, but I can't think of a single instance where economic sanctions really worked out the way they were supposed to.
Yegi, you wanted to say?
Yes, I just wanted to add that this administration said on and on that they are standing with the Iranian people and their support, their demand for a free government or a free country, but at the same time, the first move that President Trump did was passing the bill of travel ban, which banned people of the 7 majority Muslim countries to come to the United States. Jason and I worked at the time on an article about that in 2016. 60% of the people from those countries, those 7 countries coming to the United States were Iranians.
It was an Iran ban.
It was an Iran ban, and
commented.
since then, it just got worse and worse, and people in Iran are taken hostage with their own regime, and also they can't leave, and if they get to leave, like those 176 innocent people who were killed on that Ukrainian airline, they now can't come to the United States, which is where they see all of their hopes and dreams and aspirations and inspiration coming to reality.
There's evidence that the Iranians were not wholeheartedly embracing the rules of the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal. I assume you would not have advocated the Trump administration's decision to withdraw, but what is a path forward that you think could bring people together?
I think they were actually adhering to the letter of the law of that deal, at least until 2018 when President Trump pulled us out of it. What message does that send to the rest of the world when this pariah nation is holding up their end of the bargain and the U.S. says, we're going to take the ball and walk away and do something else? I don't think it sends a very strong message of trusting us. So I think any next moves with Iran are going to have to be in very close coordination with our allies. And when I say allies, I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I'm talking about our traditional allies, our long-standing allies, and those people that still believe in a liberal order that seems to me to still be the best option that we have.
How afraid were you a couple of weeks ago when missiles started to fly?
Oh my God, I was going frantic, sobbing in the house. You know what, I grew up in 8 years of war with Iraq when we didn't have any life. I think I'm still traumatized by those years. What I know is that Iranian people, even those who think a little bit maybe more hardliner than the regular ones, even those who support some actions of this regime and are the beneficiary of this regime, whether by their work or income or family relations to the regime. No one wants one more war. We have lost more than 1 million people, men, mostly. No Iranians wants war, I can say that for sure. But also we know that just on our own, we won't be able to access the freedom that we deserve, and that means we need a little bit of outside help in a very civilized way, not by throwing bomb on us.
Or cutting off food and medicine.
Or cutting off from coming to a country that we can get education and give back to the society and maybe go back and change the mentality of those who are still a little bit hardliners by what we learn here in the United States and get education and I would say Iranians look up to Americans. I think when we travel to different parts of the country that I am still new to, I constantly tell Jason that I think Iranians have more in common with American people more than anywhere else that I have ever been. We share so many similar values. We are very family oriented. In some sense, we are very traditional. We like our Nowruz as much as Americans like their Thanksgiving. We have so much in common, but unfortunately, everything has been completely plugged off.
Before we bring in the rest of the team to face questions, it's a perverse question, but let me ask you, is there, because we didn't actually go to war and there seemed to be some back channel communication between Washington and Tehran to stop Armageddon, is there weirdly some kind of opportunity now?
I think there's always an opportunity. Yegi has talked over the past 3 years about her concerns that President Trump would make a deal with the Revolutionary Guard. And I think that that's something to really keep a strong eye on. I think that Secretary of State Pompeo would not let that happen. But I also think that he might not be the Secretary of State for very long. So, I mean, anything is possible. Ultimately, we know that at some point, we will come to some kind of negotiated settlement with Iran. And I think the folks I talk to in Washington who are involved in policy desperately want to see that happen. They can't say that publicly. But there's also this attitude that Iran needs a deal much more than the US does. I think in the short term, that's probably true. But I also think that regional stability in the Middle East without Iran is impossible.